Sacred Heart's pediatric wing smells like antiseptic and desperation under the fluorescent lights that never dim. Natalie Hayes changes bedpans, updates charts in precise handwriting, speaks only when spoken to. 18 months here. Nobody knows her first name was once preceded by a rank that only 12 women in Navy history have ever worn. She moves through the corridors like someone who has learned to take up less space. Long sleeves despite Houston's heat. Hair pulled back so tight it makes her temples ache. A thermos on the break room shelf, dented military-grade steel with a Naval Special Warfare Command insignia she's tried 3 times to file off, always in the same spot, always untouched by anyone else. The other nurses have stopped asking whose it is. The limp surfaces on humid days. Days when her left knee tells the story of a roadside explosion in Sanjan Valley, Helmand Province, that left 2 Marines dead and her with 4 inches of scar tissue running from hip to ankle. Nobody asks about it. They've learned that Natalie Hayes doesn't answer questions about herself. She existed in the margins of Sacred Heart's pediatric ward the way ghosts exist in houses, present but not acknowledged, useful but invisible. The nurses gathered their lunches and moved to different tables when she sat down. Dr. Sterling looked through her rather than at her during rounds, his eyes sliding past her observations like water off waxed cloth. The residents called her the quiet one. It was not a compliment. At 0600 on a Tuesday morning in March, the hospital's automatic doors hissed open and the tenor of everything changed. Not with noise. With presence. With the specific gravity of authority that moves through spaces like weather systems, and Natalie felt it before she looked up from the nurse's station where she was updating Sophia Chen's intake chart for the 3rd time because the ink was too faint on her first attempt. The motorcade had been announced an hour earlier, protocol, security briefing, extra personnel in the lobby. But knowing something intellectually and witnessing it were different animals entirely. Admiral James Brennan moved through the hospital the way he probably moved through carrier decks and situation rooms. 63 years old. Ramrod posture. The kind of presence that made the air pressure change simply because he occupied it. Behind him came a girl in a wheelchair pushed by a hospital transport specialist, and the girl's eyes were the empty kind that Natalie recognized with the precision of someone who had seen 100 variations of the same catastrophic injury. Natalie's pen stopped mid-chart. The girl was 12. Maybe 13. Dark hair pulled into a loose braid that suggested someone had tried and then given up. Her legs were thin, atrophied, suggesting months of immobility, and they rested at an angle that told Natalie everything she needed to know about spasticity and incomplete spinal cord involvement. But it was the girl's hands that made Natalie's breathing shift. The tremors. Small ones. Not resting tremors. Movement-induced. The girl's left hand shook when she reached for the armrest of the wheelchair, a fine muscular oscillation that appeared and disappeared with intention. That's not spinal cord damage. That's something else. Dr. Sterling appeared from the administrative hallway like he'd been waiting for his cue, hand extended, smile practiced and perfected through years of smiling at people with insurance that covered his time. His suit cost more than Natalie's monthly rent. Navy tie with a tiny anchor pattern that she noticed because she always noticed those details, the way some people notice whether someone's left eye was slightly higher than their right. It was. The asymmetry bothered her. Admiral Brennan, welcome to Sacred Heart. Sterling's voice had the texture of old money and private schools. Your daughter will receive the finest care available. I've personally reviewed her case. The experimental protocol we're proposing has shown remarkable results in pediatric cases with incomplete paraplegia. I'm confident in your expertise, Dr. Sterling. The Admiral's voice was different, clipped, efficient, the kind of precise diction that came from decades of command. Sophia has been through enough. Whatever gives her the best chance. The girl in the wheelchair said nothing. Her eyes tracked the ceiling tiles as if counting them, and Natalie watched the tremors in her left hand intensify when a nurse wheeled her toward the pediatric intensive care unit. Toward Dr. Sterling's private wing. Toward whatever protocol cost $40,000 per dose and moved through the hospital's budget with such careful discretion that even the pharmacy techs didn't ask questions. Natalie lowered her head and returned to her charting. The ink was still too faint. She started over. But her hands were steady now. That was the difference between who she had been and who she was now. Fear used to make her shake. Fear used to be something that lived in her chest like a second heartbeat. Now fear was information. Fear was data. Fear was useful only if it sharpened her focus, and her focus right now was singular and specific, the girl in the wheelchair who was being wheeled into a room at the end of the hallway, toward a treatment protocol that Natalie already knew was wrong because she had seen those tremors before, and they didn't match the diagnosis that everyone kept repeating in hushed tones and medical abbreviations. Incomplete T12 paraplegia from blast trauma. That's what the chart said. That's what everyone believed. But tremors like that meant something else entirely. Natalie carried the intake charts toward the PQ, moving with the kind of tactical efficiency she had learned 17 years ago and had never unlearned, checking corners before entering rooms the way you checked corners before entering hostile territory. The only difference was that now the territory was fluorescent lit and smelled like industrial bleach instead of desert dust and diesel exhaust from Hums. Admiral Brennan stood in Sophia's room with his hand on the girl's shoulder. The gesture was meant to be protective. It looked more like a man trying to anchor himself to something that might float away. Natalie had seen that look before. She had felt that look when her son Marcus was 4 years old and she was shipping out on a deployment that would last 9 months and she wasn't sure he would remember her face when she returned. "I need to get her vitals," Natalie said. Not a question. The words came out the way she had learned to make them come out, deferential enough to pass, efficient enough to work. The thermos was still in the break room. The patch was still sewn into the lining of her jacket in the staff locker. Nobody here knew. Nobody here needed to know. She moved to Sophia's side and extended the blood pressure cuff, and the Admiral stepped back because that was what men at his level did when nurses asked them to move. They moved. "I'm Natalie," she said quietly, and she watched Sophia's eyes track toward her for the first time. The left eye lag was minimal. Probably nothing. Probably her imagination. "I'll be checking on you during my shift. You let me know if you need anything." The girl nodded slightly. The tremor in her left hand continued, steady and rhythmic, like someone tapping out a code on Morse equipment. But that wasn't what caught Natalie's attention. That wasn't what made her entire body go very still for exactly 2 seconds while her brain processed information that couldn't possibly be accurate. It was the photograph taped to the inside of Sophia's wheelchair frame. A military unit patch. Faded from sun exposure. A trident, the Navy SEAL trident, visible even through the damage and age. And below the patch, a name written in careful handwriting, Sophia's big brother. Lieutenant Commander James Brennan, Jr. Natalie knew that name because her 17-year-old son Marcus had mentioned it exactly once, 3 weeks ago, in a text message that arrived at 2,300 hours and said, "Mom, my unit commander is insane." Good insane. The kind that keeps you alive. She looked at Sophia's face and saw the Admiral's jawline, the same chin-forward structure, and suddenly understood that this girl's older brother was commanding her son's unit in Kandahar. That this girl's mother had died in that same province, in that same bombing that had killed 2 of Marcus's friends. That Sophia's tremors were not a coincidence and not a spinal cord injury and not something that $40,000 per dose of experimental therapy was going to fix. Natalie took Sophia's blood pressure. 118/76. The girl's heart rate was 89. Normal for a frightened child in a hospital. All of her numbers looked fine. All of her numbers were lying. The results look good, Natalie said, and she stepped back, and she did not let her voice change, and she did not let her eyes linger on a patch sewn into the wheelchair's frame, and she kept her hands from trembling because trembling was for people who still believed that following the rules would save the people they loved. The Admiral thanked her. Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway already checking his watch. Rounds would start in 20 minutes. Sophia would be scheduled for her first dose of the experimental protocol by Thursday. The girl's tremors would probably get worse because that's what happened when you treated incomplete neurological damage with a therapy designed for a completely different condition, but the billing would continue, the insurance would pay, and by the time anyone noticed that Sophia was declining instead of improving, there would be paperwork trails and authorizations and 1,000 reasons why nobody should ask too many questions. Natalie moved toward the door and lowered her head in a way that was becoming as natural as breathing, and she thought about the patch in her own locker, and she thought about her son in Kandahar, and she thought about what it meant that Sophia's brother was keeping Marcus alive in the same province where their mother had died. She thought about a lot of things while Dr. Sterling walked past her without acknowledgement, already dictating notes into his phone. He never looked at her. He never had. It was the absence of his attention that would eventually become the most important fact of his life, though he didn't know it yet. The hospital's intercom crackled overhead, calling for a rapid response team to the 4th floor. The sound echoed through the corridors and was gone, leaving only the fluorescent hum and the sound of the ventilator wheeze from the rooms around them. Natalie walked back to the nurse's station and pulled up Sophia's chart on the computer screen, and this time when she updated the intake information, she noted everything. The tremors. The timeline. The way the girl's eyes had tracked toward her like she was the only person in the room who wasn't already lying. And she typed very carefully, and she was very thorough, and she left no room for anyone to claim they didn't understand what she was documenting. Because that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't even close to the worst part. The morning round started like every other morning at Sacred Heart, fluorescent lights humming their mechanical dirge, the ICU smelling of antiseptic and something underneath it, something like copper and salt. Natalie pushed the med cart beside Dr. Sterling as he stopped at each bed, his voice carrying the weight of a man accustomed to being obeyed. 3 residents trailed behind him like satellites orbiting a star. When they reached Sophia Brennan's room, the Admiral was already awake in the visitor's chair, still wearing yesterday's uniform with the creases still sharp enough to cut glass. Sophia lay motionless beneath the white hospital blanket, her dark eyes tracking the ceiling. 12 years old. Paralyzed from the waist down since the bombing in Kandahar 3 months ago, the same bombing that had killed her mother during a routine diplomatic visit. The same bombing where Natalie had been standing 40 feet away, loading bodies into a dust-choked helicopter while the girl screamed for her mother. Dr. Sterling moved through his examination with the efficiency of ritual. Temperature. Heart rate. Pupil response. He was thorough, Natalie would give him that. Competent. The kind of competent that made people trust him. She watched Sophia's lower legs as Sterling repositioned the girl's hips for a neurological assessment, lifting one leg slightly to check for muscle tone. That's when Natalie saw it. A small, involuntary tremor. Just a flutter in the girl's left calf muscle during the passive movement. A tremor that shouldn't exist if the spinal transection was complete. If Sophia's paralysis was truly neurological damage from the bomb fragmentation. That kind of tremor meant something else. Something Sterling should have caught on his first day treating her. Natalie's hands remained steady, pushing the medication cart forward. The tremor came again. Barely perceptible. The kind of thing you only noticed if you'd held more spinal cord injuries than most surgeons would see in a lifetime. If you'd watched men in Kandahar try to move legs that should have been dead, legs that weren't supposed to twitch. Pain is data. That's what the trauma surgeons had told her 17 years ago when she was just a corpsman learning how to read the body's language. She said nothing during rounds. Just observed. Just documented mentally. But when Sterling was finishing his exam notes, she stepped slightly closer. Doctor, I noticed involuntary tremors in her left lower extremity during passive repositioning. Small ones. During the leg lift. Sterling's pen stopped moving. He turned slowly, his eyes moving from the notes to her face with the deliberateness of a predator calculating distance to prey. The room temperature seemed to drop. Admiral Brennan straightened in his chair. The 3 residents exchanged glances. Nurse Hayes, Sterling said, and something in the way he elongated her name was already a dismissal. I've been a neurologist for 20 years. You've been a floor nurse for how long? 18 months. She didn't answer. He didn't wait. Sacred Heart is your first real hospital job, isn't it? After whatever community college program you attended. He looked at her badge as if reading it for the first time. His voice was a blade wrapped in politeness, the kind of politeness that cuts deeper because it sounds civil. I appreciate your enthusiasm. Truly. But perhaps you should stick to what you were trained for. Changing bedpans. Taking temperatures. Leaving the actual medicine to those of us with medical degrees. Natalie's jaw tightened. Just one muscle. Just the briefest clench. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator's mechanical rhythm from the next bed over, that steady wheeze like a metronome counting down something that mattered. Admiral Brennan shifted uncomfortably, his hand moving toward his daughter's shoulder. One of the residents stared at the floor. The other two looked at Sterling with the particular expression of people who had just watched a man reveal something about himself they couldn't unsee. A single tear escaped Natalie's left eye. She saw it coming and didn't try to stop it, there was no point. But she wiped it away with the heel of her hand before it could fall further, and when her hand dropped, her eyes were still locked on Sterling's. Still steady. Still level. I've seen enough spine injuries in Kandahar to know when someone's being kept sick for profit, she said. Her voice barely above a whisper. Not trembling. Not cracking. Just flat. Just fact. Like reading vitals. Like stating a patient's blood type. I've seen it before. Then she turned and walked out without waiting for his response. The silence followed her down the hallway like a physical thing, heavy enough to touch. 3 hours later, Natalie sat down at the center table in the break room with her lunch, a sandwich she'd made at 5 in the morning, already stale. 4 other nurses were seated around the table. She recognized all of them. Worked shifts with most of them. One of them, Rachel Martinez, had asked to borrow her stethoscope just last week. They all stood up at nearly the same moment. Gathered their trays. Moved to the table by the window without a word. No excuses. No awkwardness. Just a coordinated exodus that felt like a rehearsed drill. One of them, someone Natalie didn't recognize from the day's shift, whispered loud enough to carry across the break room, "Can you believe she talked back to Dr. Sterling like that?" In front of an admiral. Another voice answered from the window table, pitched just barely to be heard, "I heard she accused him of something. During rounds. Something about the treatment." Natalie unwrapped her sandwich and ate it anyway, because the alternative was to leave, and leaving meant Sterling won. So she chewed mechanically and drank her water and sat alone at a table designed for 8 people. A nurse entered the break room, saw her, froze, and turned around without getting anything. She could see the nurse walking down the hallway toward the parking lot through the glass doors. By Friday afternoon, Natalie was restocking the supply cart on the surgical floor when she noticed the white paper on the bulletin board outside the nurse manager's office. Her hands were in the middle of counting gauze packages when she saw her own name. She set the gauze down carefully. Each package. Each one. Precise. The write-up was printed in the hospital's standard disciplinary format. Her name. The date. The violation, overstepping scope of practice, providing unsolicited medical opinions beyond nurse training, further violations will result in immediate termination. She read it once. Didn't move. Didn't reach for it. Just read it the way you read a lab result that confirms what you already knew. Then she returned to the supply cart and continued counting. 43. 44. 45. 20 staff members walked past the board during shift change. She saw 3 of them stop and read it. She felt their eyes move toward her. She didn't look up from the packages. That evening, Sterling paged her to the ICU nurse's station. He was reviewing charts with 2 residents again, and as she approached, he looked up with something that might have been a smile if smiles could come from a place without light in them. "Ah, Bedpan Betty," he said. The nickname landed like a punch that nobody else heard. "Come here for a moment." Natalie stood at the edge of the nurse's station. Not inside. Not fully present. Just waiting. "I need you to understand something," Sterling continued, setting down his pen with precision. This hospital has standards. We maintain those standards for our patients. For the integrity of our care. We can't have nurses who barely finished their education, community college training, whatever that constitutes, questioning physicians who've published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Who've done actual research. Actual work. Do you understand what I'm saying? His residents didn't look at him. They didn't look at her either. Yes, doctor, Natalie said. Her voice was perfectly level. Deferential in exactly the way that Sterling required. The way that would keep her employed long enough to do what needed to be done. I understand. Good. Because I'd hate to see you make another mistake like that. Mistakes have consequences. He picked up his pen again, dismissing her without another word. You can go. Natalie turned and walked back down the hallway, and everything inside her that had been burning since the moment she'd seen those muscle tremors in Sophia's leg contracted into something smaller. Something colder. Something that would not require her to feel anything at all for the next 72 hours. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't even close to what was coming. Dr. Sterling's shoes clicked against the marble floor of the River Oaks Country Club with the precision of a man who had never taken a wrong step in his life. 7 holes behind him. 9 ahead. The fairway stretched green and perfect under the Houston sun, and Richard Worthington was about to sink a putt when Sterling's phone found his ear. Rich, we may have a liability issue. Sterling's voice was measured, conversational, the tone of a man sharing a minor concern between friends. A nurse. Minimal experience, possible credential problems. She's overstepping boundaries with a high-profile patient. Admiral Brennan's daughter, actually. I need the board aware before this becomes a lawsuit. Worthington lowered his putter. He had known Sterling for 8 years. They played 18 holes together twice a month. Sterling had never once mentioned a liability issue that didn't eventually require a board vote and a check written to make it disappear. How bad? Worthington asked. Preventable if we move now. I'll email you her file. You might want to schedule an emergency review. Before the Admiral gets the wrong impression about her competence. The line went dead. Worthington stood on the 7th green, holding a putter in one hand and a phone that suddenly felt heavier than it should. He didn't know that Sterling had paid Jennifer Matsuda, a so-called patient safety consultant with a reputation for finding exactly what she was hired to find, to audit 6 months of Natalie's charts. He didn't know that Sterling had never once consulted institutional review boards before ordering experimental treatments. He didn't know that Advanced Neurological Solutions, the company charging $40,000 per infusion for Sophia Brennan's medication, was registered with Sterling's name as the sole owner. He only knew what Sterling had told him. And Sterling never lied. By that afternoon, Jennifer Matsuda sat in Sterling's office on the 4th floor of Sacred Heart, a manila folder open on her lap. She had black-rimmed glasses and the efficient posture of someone who had spent 20 years finding problems in other people's work. Sterling handed her a stack of papers. 6 months. Everything she's documented on pediatric patients. I'm particularly interested in the Brennan girl. Multiple observations made without physician orders. Concerns raised about treatment protocols she has no authority to question. You understand what I'm looking for. Matsuda didn't blink. Scope of practice violations. Unauthorized clinical assessment. Insubordination documented by a medical doctor. Exactly. Sterling leaned back in his chair, which whispered against the leather like something wounded. I need it airtight. Nothing that survives legal review. How quickly? Monday. The board meets Monday afternoon. Matsuda made a note. She would find it. People like her always did. They understood the architecture of bureaucracy the way surgeons understood anatomy, where to cut, how deep to go, which arteries were safe to leave bleeding. What neither of them knew was that Natalie had already noticed. She stood at the nurse's station that evening, watching Sterling move through the ICU with the fluid precision of apex predators entering water. He carried Sophia's chart, and he carried it like a man defending territory. When Rachel, the afternoon charge nurse, approached him near Sophia's room with a question about her pain management, Sterling's voice came low and final. "All medication adjustments require my verbal approval first. No standing orders. No nursing discretion." "That understood." Rachel nodded. She had worked with Sterling for 3 years. She understood the architecture of his authority the way a fish understands currents, invisible until you were caught in them. Natalie watched from 30 feet away. She didn't move. She didn't react. But her jaw clenched so tight she could feel it in her temples. By Friday, Sophia's physical therapy sessions had been reduced from twice daily to twice weekly. Natalie found out because she saw the updated care plan posted on the digital board at 6:06 a.m., before the morning shift began. The rationale was documented in Sterling's handwriting: patient requires extended rest periods for medication stabilization. PT cleared only when vital support increased activity. Vital support. The phrase sat in Natalie's chest like shrapnel. She found Torres, the physical therapist, in the PT gym. He was a former Army combat medic who had spent 14 months at FOB Shank in Logar province before a knee injury ended his military career. He understood the difference between healing and harm the way only someone who had seen both could. "Have you noticed her muscle response changing?" Natalie kept her voice level, conversational. Two colleagues discussing a patient. Nothing unusual. Torres was organizing resistance bands, his movements careful and precise. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, he kept his eyes on the bands. 3 weeks ago she had involuntary flexion in both feet. Response to stimulus. Now nothing. Just nothing. He tied a band in a tight knot. Sterling cancelled today's session. Said she's not stable enough. She's getting worse because of the treatment, not despite it. Torres finally looked at her. His eyes were the color of weathered concrete, and they carried the weight of a man who had learned long ago that speaking truth had consequences. "If you put that in writing, you'll be fired by morning," Torres said quietly. "I've got a kid in college. Full ride to UT, but that scholarship, it doesn't cover everything. I can't afford to be the guy who says no to Sterling. I'm sorry. I know you're trying to help her." He returned to his bands. The conversation was over. Natalie left the gym at 7:34 p.m. The parking garage was nearly empty, her footsteps echoing off concrete like a countdown. She drove to her apartment in Montrose, a 2-bedroom place she rented because it was affordable and because no one there knew her name. The walls were bare. The refrigerator contained exactly what a person needed and nothing more. She opened her laptop at 8:12 p.m. and typed, "Advanced Neurological Solutions Houston." The company appeared in the search results within seconds. Registered for months ago. Address, a mailbox in a commercial plaza on Bellaria Boulevard. Listed owner, Dr. Marcus Sterling, MD. Her hands moved across the keyboard like they had been trained to do this, which they had. Digital forensics wasn't so different from field triage. Find the problem. Document it. Report it to command. She screenshot everything. Filed it away. The thing about becoming invisible is that it teaches you to see. That night, the fluorescent lights in her apartment hummed their electric lullaby, and Natalie sat in the dark beyond their reach, holding the weight of what she knew. Sterling wasn't just protecting his reputation. He was building an empire, one $40,000 infusion at a time, one sick child at a time, one family desperate enough to trust a doctor they had no reason to doubt. She had tried to speak to Admiral Brennan on Thursday morning. The Admiral had been walking toward Sophia's room, his uniform immaculate, his face carrying the kind of exhaustion that came from commanding people in places where death was the only guaranteed outcome. Natalie had positioned herself carefully, not blocking his path, not confrontational, just present. "Admiral, if I could speak with you for just a moment about your daughters." Sterling had materialized between them like he had been waiting. Like he always was. Admiral, Nurse Hayes has been taken off your daughter's care team due to some concerns about her clinical judgment. If you need anything, please page me directly. The Admiral had nodded, distracted by his phone vibrating against his hip. A message about his son's unit. Casualties reported. Medevac inbound. Natalie had stood there and watched him walk away, and she had understood in that moment that fear was Sterling's most powerful ally. An Admiral worried about his son's unit wasn't going to question his daughter's treatment. An Admiral was going to trust the system, trust the doctors, trust that someone was taking care of his child while he dealt with the impossible mathematics of command in a war zone. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Sterling knew this. He had measured the Admiral's fear the way a hunter measures wind speed before taking a shot. Natalie saved every document to an encrypted folder. She didn't sleep. The sun came up on Saturday morning and found her still at her laptop, building a case against a man who had already built his fortress so carefully that challenging him would likely cost her everything. She had survived Kandahar. She had survived 3 tours and 2 Purple Hearts and the kind of memories that came alive at 3 a.m. with no warning. She had walked away from the Navy and into the anonymous corridors of Sacred Heart Hospital because she thought she could help people quietly, without fanfare, without anyone needing to know what she had done or who she had been. Now she was going to have to choose between that invisibility and a 12-year-old girl who was being systematically harmed by the man she trusted to save her. The choice, she realized, had never been hers to make. It had been made the moment she recognized something in Sophia Brennan that everyone else had missed. The moment she became the only person in this hospital who could see what was happening. And Sterling was about to find out what happened when someone like that decided she had nothing left to lose. Tuesday morning arrived like every other morning at Sacred Heart, fluorescent lights humming their electric dirge, coffee lukewarm in break room thermoses, the night shift dissolving into the day shift like watercolor bleeding into water. Natalie clocked in at 0620 hours and checked the assignment board. Pediatric wing, 3rd floor. Sophia Brennan's room was listed with a notation, Sterling's orders, no floor nurses except for vitals. No exceptions. The overnight nurse had called in sick. The floor was short 3 staff. Nobody had updated the board. Natalie moved through the corridors with the kind of invisibility she'd cultivated over 18 months, present but unnoticed, efficient but unremarkable, the way a good shadow moves across a wall. She carried her dented thermos, the one Marcus had given her before his first deployment, a gift he'd pressed into her hands without words because some conversations don't need them. The coffee inside had gone cold hours ago. She didn't care. The thermos was warm in her hands, and that was enough. She pushed open Sophia's door at 0627 hours. The girl was awake, which was unusual. Sterling's sedation protocol kept her drowsy most of the day, kept her quiet, kept her unaware of the tremors in her own muscles that didn't match the diagnosis anyone had written in her chart. Sophia turned her head as Natalie entered, and even that small movement seemed to cost something. Her lips had a bluish tint. The kind of blue that appears when oxygen isn't moving the way it should. "Morning, Sophia," Natalie said, moving to the vital signs monitor with practiced efficiency. "How's your breathing today?" "Hard," the girl whispered. Just that single word, stretched thin as tissue paper. Natalie's hands didn't pause. They moved on their own. Muscle memory developed in field hospitals where there was no time for hesitation, where you trusted your body to know what your mind couldn't yet process. She wrapped the blood pressure cuff around Sophia's small arm. Check the pulse oximeter. Watch the readings appear on the monitor screen like a confession written in numbers. BP 88/52. Dropping. O2 sat 71. Critical. Heart rate 148. Her daughter's heart was racing like a trapped bird trying to beat its way out of a cage. "Sophia, I need you to take a deep breath for me." Natalie's voice came out steady, the way it had in Kandahar when a 19-year-old Marine had a sucking chest wound and needed someone to sound like they'd done this 1,000 times before. "Can you do that?" The girl tried. Her chest wall moved unevenly. The right side barely rose at all. And then her lips went darker, not purple now, but something closer to slate. Her head tilted back. Her eyes went unfocused. Natalie saw it in the physiological grammar of Sophia's body, a lung collapsed inward, air trapped in the chest cavity, crushing the heart like a fist closing. Tension pneumothorax. The kind of injury that killed in 90 seconds if you didn't intervene. The kind of injury Natalie had treated 17 times in combat zones where the nearest surgeon was a 60-minute helicopter ride away. She hit the code button with her palm, not a press, a strike. Then she was moving, muscle and instinct and 23 years of training fusing into a single purpose. The crash cart was already there because good hospitals stock code carts in every room. Natalie rolled it closer, her hand sorting through the supplies with the speed of someone who'd done this in the dark, in rain, in the roar of helicopter rotors. 14-gauge catheter. The plastic gleamed under the hospital lights like a tiny spear. She pulled Sophia's gown open, finding the ribs beneath the thin fabric, her fingers reading the girl's anatomy the way a musician reads sheet music. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The anatomical landmarks that meant the difference between living and dying. She swabbed the site with betadine, the smell sharp as copper, and positioned the needle at a 90-degree angle to Sophia's chest wall. One motion. Clean. Committed. The needle penetrated the pleura. And then, the hiss of air escaping. A sound like a tire deflating, like pressure being released, like hope taking physical form in the space of a single second. Natalie withdrew the catheter and left the plastic cannula in place. Sophia's body convulsed once, then stilled. Color rushed back into her lips like someone had restored the saturation on a film print that had faded to grayscale. Her oxygen sac climbed. 71, 76. 82, 88. Her heart rate dropped from 148 to 124 to 112. Her eyes focused. Her breathing deepened. The code team arrived 90 seconds later, flooding through the door in blue and white scrubs, already calling for equipment and labs and all the machinery of emergency medicine. They stopped when they saw the catheter in place, the chest wall rising evenly on both sides now, the monitor displaying a sinus rhythm steady as a metronome. Dr. Sterling arrived 45 seconds after that, still holding his phone, mid-conversation with the pharmacy about dosages and refills. He saw Natalie standing at the head of Sophia's bed, her hands still poised in the position she'd held them after the procedure, and the phone went slack against his ear. "What the hell did you just do?" His voice came out thin, dangerous, like a wire strung too tight. "Needle decompression," Natalie said. Her voice didn't change pitch or tempo. "Tension pneumothorax. She's stable now." The code team confirmed it. They ran their own assessments, their own checks. Breath sounds returning bilaterally. Trachea midline. Vitals improving by the second. Sophia's small hand reached up and found Admiral Brennan's wrist as he stood frozen in the doorway, watching his daughter breathe the way he hadn't been able to in hours or days or however long Sterling's protocol had been slowly suffocating her. Sterling's face went white first. Then red, the way certain people do when their power gets questioned in front of witnesses. The color rose from his collar like a slow fire consuming him from the inside. "Everyone out," he said. His voice had gone quiet, which was worse than if he'd shouted. "Now." Except Nurse Hayes. The code team exchanged glances but obeyed. The room emptied. The door closed with a soft click that sounded like a lock turning. Sterling stepped closer. He moved the way predators move, slowly, deliberately, with the absolute certainty that nothing could stop them. "You just performed a procedure reserved for physicians. That's the textbook definition of practicing medicine without a license. Do you understand what you've just done to yourself?" "She would have died in 3 minutes," Natalie said. "You had no authority to make that decision. I was on my way. I was 15 seconds away from this room, and you decided that your judgment superseded mine. You've been explicitly told to stay away from this patient." He pulled his phone out again, and his fingers moved across the screen with mechanical precision. "This ends now. He called security first. Then the chief nursing officer. His voice stayed calm the entire time. That was the frightening part, the absence of anger, the pure administrative clarity of someone dismantling a problem. We have an immediate termination situation in the pediatric wing. Scope of practice violation, direct insubordination, patient risk. I'm sending the details now. Within 2 hours, Natalie sat in the CNO's office with the afternoon light slanting through Venetian blinds that carved the walls into parallel lines of shadow and illumination. A union representative sat beside her, a woman named Patricia who kept talking about precedent and safe harbor provisions and whistleblower protections that all seemed to dissolve the moment Sterling walked in with Jennifer Matsuda, the patient safety consultant, carrying a tablet full of carefully annotated documentation. 17 instances of charting irregularities, Matsuda said, scrolling through data with the detachment of someone reading a shopping list. 9 documented cases of scope violations. And now the incident this morning, an invasive procedure without physician authorization, without anesthesia, without informed consent from the patient's parent. The union rep tried. She really did. She saved that child's life. The girl would have died without intervention. The CNO, Dr. Margaret Foster, cut her off with a gesture that was almost kind. That may be true. But Dr. Sterling has made it clear that Ms. Hayes' continued employment represents a liability this hospital cannot accept. We have a duty to our patients to ensure all staff adhere to their scope of practice. Effective immediately, employment is terminated. It took for words. That was all. Natalie's badge was deactivated by 1200 hours. Security, a woman named Delores who wouldn't meet her eyes, escorted her to her locker. Natalie removed the items she'd brought into this fluorescent world 18 months ago, the dented thermos, a photograph of Marcus in his high school graduation gown with his arm around a girl named Jessica, and the old field jacket hanging in the back. She pulled the jacket down and felt the weight of it, the fabric worn soft as prayer by years of use. Her fingers found the seam along the inside lining and felt the faded unit patch sewn there, SEAL team insignia, worn nearly invisible by time, hidden the way she'd hidden everything else. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She didn't do any of the things people do when their worlds collapse. She just folded the jacket carefully, placed it in her bag, and walked out of Sacred Heart Hospital at 1500 hours on a Tuesday afternoon. The parking lot smelled like rain coming, that electric ozone smell that precedes a storm. Natalie stood in the late-day heat and felt the breeze coming up from the Gulf, carrying salt and distance and the promise of weather that would break the humidity in half. She drove to the VA hospital on Old Spanish Trail. The waiting room was full of faces she recognized, men and women she'd treated in field hospitals in Kandahar, in Helmand, in the forward operating bases where the wounded came in faster than they could be processed. Some of them had looked at her twice when she walked past them in the Sacred Heart pediatric wing, something flickering in their recognition before they let it pass. None of them knew her. None of them remembered the senior chief. She filled out intake forms with a pen that kept stuttering on the paper. PTSD. Hypervigilance. Survivor's guilt. Difficulty maintaining civilian employment. The intake coordinator, a woman with kind eyes and a government ID badge, asked her the question they always asked, "What finally made you come in?" Natalie looked at her hands. The tremor wasn't fear. It was restraint, the effort required to hold something in place when it wanted to break free. "I don't have anywhere left to hide," she said. She meant it. But she didn't know yet that hiding wasn't over. It was only beginning. The hospital conference room fell silent when Marcus dropped the shadow box on the polished table. Not the kind of silence that fills rooms gradually. This was the kind that arrived all at once, like a power failure. 17 people stopped breathing. The frame landed hard enough that the glass caught the fluorescent light and threw it back like a weapon. The nameplate read, Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, Naval Special Warfare Command. Admiral Brennan's head lifted slowly. His son stood at the table, not in civilian posture but military bearing, shoulders squared, the kind of stance you didn't forget even when you were 17 years old and wearing a community college hoodie. He'd learned posture from watching his mother move through the world for 16 years without saying her rank aloud. "My mom said I should never show these," Marcus said. His voice didn't shake. The Hayes family apparently didn't tremble under pressure. "But they need to see who you fired." Dr. Reeves, the hospital administrator, reached for the shadow box with both hands, the way someone handles something that might detonate. Inside the glass frame, against faded navy dress blue background, hung medals arranged in careful ascending order of precedence. A ribbon rack that told the story of a career that didn't belong in a pediatric ward changing bedpans. A career that belonged in rooms where life and death decisions were made by people who'd already made them 1,000 times before. She read the nameplate aloud, and her voice cracked on each syllable like the words themselves were too heavy for standard pronunciation. Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes. Naval Special Warfare Command. A SEAL team leader, there for his daughter's spinal surgery, sitting in the third chair from the door, stood at attention. Not slowly. Not theatrically. With the automatic precision of someone whose muscle memory never erased itself. He moved his lips and named each decoration like he was calling roll at muster. Bronze Star with Valor. The room contracted. 2 purple hearts. Board members looked at each other. Someone's pen fell. Nobody picked it up. Navy Commendation Medal. Afghanistan Campaign Medal with 4 Bronze Service Stars. Each medal made its own sound in the silence. Not the medals themselves, the absence of air moving. The sound of 12 people realizing they just terminated an employee whose service record made their entire lives look like dress rehearsals. Dr. Sterling opened his mouth. The words never arrived. "I worked with her in Kandahar," the SEAL team leader said quietly. His name was Martinez. His daughter was going to walk again because Natalie had refused to accept that she wouldn't. "She saved my platoon sergeant's life with field expedient equipment in a firefight. Taught half my unit how to treat penetrating thoracic trauma. This woman doesn't just know medicine. She lives it. Every single breath." The IT director, former Marine, name of Simmons, worked in Sacred Heart's basement with servers and cables and the kind of technical precision that made him invisible at hospital meetings, stood up from the back corner where he'd been sitting in silence since the board convened. Dr. Sterling attempted to delete security footage from the pediatric ward. His voice was flat, conversational, the tone of someone reporting weather. Specifically the footage from March 17th. The date he switched Sophia Brennan's medication logs. "He didn't know that my job includes redundant backups. Every frame is preserved. I've already reported the deletion attempt to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, along with the footage itself and Dr. Sterling's financial records, which you can access through your legal team." Lightning didn't strike Dr. Sterling. It should have. The universe should have corrected itself violently. Instead, he just sat there, his face the color of old gauze, his hands making fists that he'd already forgotten how to open. Admiral Brennan stood without speaking. He walked to the shadow box and stared at it the way a man stares at something he suddenly understands about someone he loves. Then he turned to face his daughter's former nurse, a woman he'd seen walking past Sophia's room in silence, carrying linens and meal trays, a ghost in scrubs. "What's your first name?" he asked. "Natalie." That was all. No apologies. No explanations. No testimony about how she'd sat with Sophia through night shifts when the child woke up screaming from nightmares about the explosion that took her mother. No mention of the conversations about pain being information, about the body having memory that doctors sometimes couldn't read because they weren't listening. The name was enough. 6 months compressed itself into a single afternoon. The Texas Medical Board suspended Dr. Sterling's license within 72 hours. The hospital terminated his privileges and filed a civil lawsuit for fraud. The FBI seized his records, $680,000 in payments for treatments that never happened or treatments designed to fail. His wife filed for divorce when reporters appeared on their River Oaks driveway. His attorney's fees exceeded his ability to pay them. 2 other patients under his experimental protocols, both deaths previously attributed to their underlying conditions were reclassified as cases requiring investigation. Medical homicide was a phrase that began appearing in official documents. By the second week, Sterling wasn't at Sacred Heart anymore. By the end of the first month, he wasn't practicing medicine anywhere in Texas. By the end of the third month, he was sitting behind a folding table in a strip mall parking lot on the southwest side of Houston, rain hammering the canvas above him, a banner reading supplemental insurance, low rates soaked and drooping like a flag at half-mast. Commission-based work. $140 on his first day. Legal fees at $15,000 weekly. A former patient walked by and didn't make eye contact. A reporter recognized him from an old hospital photo. The man's dignity didn't just fail, it evaporated completely, leaving behind only the administrative skeleton of a career that had finally been hollowed out from the inside. The rain pooled on his materials. He didn't move. Natalie Hayes moved back to Sacred Heart in a different capacity. The hospital board voted unanimously, this time without discussion, without debate, to create the position of Director, Veteran Family Care Program. She designed it from nothing. She chose the third floor, the quietest wing, the space overlooking the parking lot where rain fell like applause in the afternoons. She hired 8 staff nurses, 4 of them former military, a former Army medic, a Navy nurse corpsman, 2 Air Force surgical techs who understood the specific language of trauma without requiring it to be explained. She commissioned murals painted by veteran volunteers, Kandahar mountains rendered in watercolor, a helicopter silhouette against a desert sky, hands clasping hands in the style of ancient frescoes. Her office displayed the shadow box. Not hidden anymore. The faded unit patch from the inside of her jacket was mounted beside it with a placard, "Remember who you are." Sophia Brennan began physical therapy the first day the program opened. She came through the doors in her wheelchair like she was arriving for combat, jaw set, hands gripping the armrests. Dr. Chen, the new neurologist, a former Navy trauma surgeon, a woman who understood both military medicine and pediatric neurology in ways that made her dangerous to people who moved carelessly, had already completed the baseline assessment. The sensation, Dr. Chen had told Natalie privately. Deep tissue, bilateral lower extremities. No active motor control yet, but the neural pathways are intact. He kept her sedated specifically to prevent her from discovering what was still possible. He was prolonging her condition for billing cycles. The first time Sophia took a step between parallel bars, her mother wasn't there to witness it. Her mother was in Arlington under a white marble stone. But her brother was there, Lieutenant Commander Brennan, home on leave, standing in the corner in dress uniform like he was guarding something sacred. And Natalie was there, watching with the same focused intensity she deployed in operating rooms and field hospitals and the moment before a needle found its mark in a child's chest cavity. Sophia moved 1 foot forward. Then the other. Her legs trembled, not from weakness but from the effort of remembering how to carry weight. The parallel bars caught the late afternoon light. A monitor beeped steady rhythm in the background, sinus rhythm, strong and regular, the sound of a heart that had learned to trust itself again. 10 steps today, Dr. Chen said, making notes. That's excellent progress. Sophia made it 12 before her legs decided they'd done enough. Natalie walked over as the girl was lowering herself back into the wheelchair, still dependent on it for distance, but no longer defined by it. Sophia looked up with the grin of someone who'd just proven something to the universe. 12, Sophia said. That's 2 more than yesterday. Natalie extended her hand for a high five. Their palms met with a sound like a starting gun. Like the beginning of something that had already taken too long to arrive. You beat your record, Natalie said. Which means tomorrow you do 13. Dr. Chen says maybe a walker by Christmas. Dr. Chen knows what she's talking about. Real walking, not just therapy walking. Real walking. Mom would have. Sophia's voice caught, the way a child's voice does when grief arrives unannounced. But she didn't stop talking. The Hayes family, even those not born into it, apparently learned composure early. Mom would have liked that. Admiral Brennan stood in the corner with his son, and for the first time since Natalie had encountered him in the hospital corridors, his face carried something besides desperate faith. It carried pride. It carried the knowledge that his daughter was going to walk again. That the quiet nurse with the scarred hands who'd stood silently in the background had seen what everyone else had missed. That evening, Marcus sat in her office during his lunch break from community college, where he was studying to be a paramedic. He looked at the shadow box hanging on the wall, then back at his mother. "You doing okay?" he asked. Natalie followed his gaze to the frame. The medals caught the desk lamp and threw back small reflections. Bronze. Purple. Silver. The visual record of a life spent saying yes when yes was the hardest answer available. "Yeah," she said. "I think I finally am." The phone on her desk buzzed. A new patient incoming, Marine Sergeant's 8-year-old daughter, traumatic brain injury, transferred from Germany, 3 hospitals saying nothing more could be done. Prognosis uncertain. Declining function under aggressive treatment protocols. Nobody considering alternative approaches. Natalie's jaw moved like she was grinding something down to powder. She stood without another word. Her son followed her to the nurse's station where the chart was waiting. She reviewed it with the speed of someone who'd read 1,000 medical files and could see the patterns invisible to people who didn't know what they were looking at. The treatment timeline. The billing codes. The dosages that didn't match standard protocols. The signature on every order, a physician who'd learned medicine but never learned to listen. "You think it's another Sterling situation?" one of her nurses asked, the former Army medic, carrying the kind of operational instinct that came from trauma medicine in desert heat. "I think we don't take anyone's word that a patient is hopeless until we've seen for ourselves," Natalie said. "Get Dr. Chen and Dr. Patel on neuroconsults. I need baseline PT assessments before any new protocols. And I need a full audit of her previous treatment records. Everything. Medications, billing, the whole timeline." She picked up the chart and headed toward the elevator. Marcus caught up with her in the corridor. "You never told me what you said to Sophia. When you got fired. Right after you saved her." Natalie pressed the elevator button. The doors opened with a pneumatic sigh that sounded like relief. "I didn't say anything," she said. "I just did what needed to be done." That's the most senior chief answer I've ever heard. The elevator descended. Natalie stood in the corner with her son beside her and the chart in her hands, and she thought about 5 years of silence. 5 years of keeping her head down, burying herself beneath anonymity, refusing to let anyone see what she carried inside her bones. She thought about Sophia taking 12 steps today. She thought about Admiral Brennan's face when he finally understood who'd been standing in his daughter's room all along. In the parking lot that night, she paused before getting in her car. She looked back at the hospital, lit up against the Houston sky like a promise kept. The windows on the 3rd floor glowed warm and patient. Murals visible from this distance like promises painted on walls. A veteran family care program that hadn't existed 6 months ago because no one had trusted the quiet person in the room. For the first time in 5 years, the nightmares didn't come that night. You don't need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. Sometimes you just need someone brave enough to refuse to give up. If this story hit you, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? And share this with someone who needs to know that the quietest people in the room might just be holding everything together. Thank you for watching.